On the morning of November the 5th, 1796, the most powerful woman in the world collapsed on the cold stone floor of a small water closet in the Winter Palace. She was 67 years old. She had ruled the largest empire on earth for 34 years. And the servants who found her could not lift her, so they laid a mattress on the floor of her bedroom and dragged her body onto it. She never spoke another word. The court remembers her for a number. People say there are dozens of lovers, 12, 22. Some say things far darker, and we will get to where those stories came from, because that part matters more than you think. What nobody knew at the time was that the men in Catherine's life were never really a private matter at all. She had built them into an actual office of the Russian state, a salary, an apartment, a job title, an institution that ran the empire from a bedroom. And standing somewhere in that palace as she lay dying was the last man to ever hold that office. 29 years old. A boy she had pulled out of nowhere and turned into one of the richest men in Russia. His name was Platon Zubov. Within hours, he would lose everything. Within 5 years, he would help murder the man who took it from him. This is the story of the favourites of Catherine the Great. Who they were, what the position actually cost them, and what happened to the last one when the woman who made him died on a bedroom floor. It was 1762, and Catherine was standing in front of a regiment of Russian soldiers in a military uniform she had no right to wear, asking them to follow her against her own husband. She wasn't even Russian. She was a minor German princess named Sophie, shipped to St. Petersburg as a teenager in 1744 to marry the heir to the throne, a strange, cruel man named Peter who preferred playing with toy soldiers to speaking to his wife. The marriage was a disaster for 18 years, and then Catherine did something almost no consort in European history had ever pulled off. She overthrew him. Within days, Peter was dead, officially from a hemorrhoidal colic, which is the kind of cause of death that fools absolutely no one. So she had the throne. But she held it the way you hold a knife by the blade. Here is what you have to understand, and it is the thing the rumours designed to make you forget. Catherine had no blood claim to Russia. None. She was a foreigner who had murdered a Romanov and taken his crown. Every powerful man around her had watched exactly how it was done, which meant every powerful man around her was a potential threat who knew the playbook. A woman in that position was supposed to last a season, a placeholder until a real man stepped in. She decided she would never be that. And the method she chose was unlike anything any monarch, man or woman, had ever done out in the open. She turned her private life into an office of the state. Most kings hid their mistresses. Louis XV of France tucked his women into side apartments and pretended in public they didn't exist. Catherine did the reverse. She built a recognized court position. The chosen man moved into a specific apartment directly below her own, joined to it by a private staircase. He drew an enormous salary. He held a rank. The court knew. The ambassadors knew, and they wrote home about it. It was, in every sense that mattered, a job. The Russians had a word for him, the favourite. Over 34 years the position was filled, again and again. But these men were not interchangeable. One of them changed the map of Europe. One of them may have secretly married her. And the last one was a boy who never understood what he had walked into. If you remember only one of Catherine's favourites, make it this one, Grigory Potyomkin. He came into her orbit as a young guards officer around the time of the coup. Tall, loud, brilliant, reckless, with the use of only one eye and a brooding intensity that women at court found magnetic and men found unnerving. By the early 1770s they were lovers, but this was nothing like the others. Hundreds of their letters survive. And they do not read like a queen and her plaything. They read like two people who could not function apart. She called him her twin soul. She wrote to him in the dead of night, furious 1 minute, desperate the next. He was jealous, possessive, impossible. And if a love affair were the only thing between them, Potyomkin might have ended up like all the others, pensioned off and forgotten. But then something happened that historians still argue about to this day. Many believe that around 1774, Catherine and Potyomkin secretly married. There is no certificate. There are letters where she seems to call him her husband. References to a church, hints dropped to the handful of people they trusted. And no, that is not a romantic legend invented later. Serious scholars take it seriously. If it's true, the Empress of Russia spent the last 2 decades of her life secretly married to a one-eyed soldier from the provinces, and almost no one alive knew it. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Their romance burned out within a few years. The fighting was too much. In any other court, that's the end of the man. Instead, they invented something brand new. Potyomkin stepped out of the bedroom and into the government and became the single most powerful man in the empire. He conquered Crimea for her. He built whole cities from empty ground along the Black Sea. Sevastopol, Kherson, Nikolaev. Cities that still exist, cities still being fought over in our own century. He created a navy from nothing. He governed the entire south of Russia like a king in his own right. And then he did the strangest thing of all. He started choosing Catherine's next lovers for her. Sit with that for a second. The man she may have secretly married personally screened and selected the younger men who would take his old place in her bed. He recommended them. He trained them. Several later favourites were his own protégés. Many trusted to keep her content without threatening his grip on real power. So yeah, not your average breakup. That is the engine that drove the whole system at its peak. It was never just romance. It was politics, patronage and power braided into one rope. A handsome young officer who caught her eye could go from nobody to count, to landowner, to millionaire in a matter of months. The gifts are almost impossible to comprehend now. Palaces, diamonds, cash by the cartload, and serfs, tens of thousands of human beings, signed over as property like furniture. One modern estimate puts Catherine's total lifetime spending on her favourites at the equivalent of well over $1 billion today. And it's worth saying plainly, the wealth she handed these men was measured in people. The same generosity the romantics admire was paid for by serfs who never had a name in any of these letters. Everything was in place for this arrangement to run forever. Catherine just didn't know what everything was quietly building toward. Because in 1791, the man who built it all died. Potemkin collapsed on an open road in the south on a journey and died in the grass beside his carriage. When the news reached Catherine, witnesses said she screamed, fainted, and could not be consoled for days. She wrote that she had no one left to lean on. The twin soul was gone. She was 62. And the one man who had always chosen her companions, the man who kept the entire system safe, was on the ground. So who would choose the next one? She did, herself. And it was the worst decision of the whole arrangement. You clicked on a number. So let's deal with the number, because it's where almost everyone gets this story wrong. People will tell you Catherine had 22 lovers, or 12, or some wilder figure with no source behind it at all. Here's the honest answer. Historians who have actually gone through the court records and the salary ledgers count roughly 12 men who held the official office across her 34-year reign. 12 who moved into the apartment, drew the income, held the recognized place at her side. Were there a handful of brief, undocumented attachments on top of that? Maybe. She was a woman of enormous appetite for company and affection, and she said as much herself. But the lurid numbers floating around the internet are inflations, and the worst stories about her are outright fabrications invented by her enemies. And no, I'm not making that up. We have to talk about why, because it tells you exactly how powerful she really was. When Catherine died, her reputation was attacked across Europe within months, and the attacks were sexual, every one of them. This was deliberate. A woman who ruled an empire alone, who took young lovers openly, who refused to remarry and hand her power to a man, threatened every assumption the 18th century held about how the world was supposed to run. Years later, a second wave of slander surfaced, even uglier than the first, and it's the one that stuck, the grotesque story involving a horse. It is completely false. It has no contemporary source whatsoever. It was almost certainly invented after her death for the specific purpose of humiliating her and erasing the legacy of one of the most effective rulers Russia ever produced. Think about what that admits. They couldn't beat her on the record, so they went after her body instead. That is not a story about Catherine. That is a story about what frightened the men who outlived her, because the record is staggering. Under Catherine, Russia expanded enormously, won major wars, founded hundreds of towns, built the core of the Hermitage collection, and traded letters with the great philosophers of the age. By the cold standard of statecraft, she was a triumph. The only way to bring her down was to lie about who she slept with. The number got inflated, the stories got obscene. And 2.5 centuries later, people still type that number into a search bar without once asking who first wrote it down or why. Now, the men themselves. Most followed the same arc. A young officer in his 20s, handsome, presented at court, a stretch of intense favour, lavish gifts. Then a dismissal that was almost always generous. Because when Catherine was finished with a favourite, she did not destroy him. She pensioned him off with estates and a fortune and sent him away rich. Several married well afterward and lived comfortably on her money. As breakups go, it was the most expensive in European history, and the men rarely complained. So yeah, not great if your worst-case scenario is becoming a millionaire. One of them, a gentle young man named Alexander Lanskoy, she seems to have genuinely loved. He died suddenly of illness in his 20s, while still in favour, and Catherine shut herself away, for weeks wrecked. Whatever the propaganda said, these were not disposable toys to her. She formed real attachments. She grieved like anyone would. But by the late 1780s she was ageing, the wars were grinding on, and Potemkin, her anchor, was first absent in the south and then, in 1791, dead. Into that gap. Into the loneliness of a woman in her 60s who had outlived the love of her life, walked a 22-year-old officer with a beautiful face and almost nothing behind it. Platon Zubov. If you're the kind of person who came here for the parts of history nobody else tells, that's the entire reason this channel exists. So consider subscribing while you're here. Because the last chapter of Catherine's life is the part that actually matters. And it's coming up now. While Catherine was falling for a boy 40 years her junior, something else was quietly brewing on the other side of the palace. Her own son was watching, and he was keeping count. By the time Catherine took up with Platon Zubov in 1789, she was 60 and he was 22, a gap of 38 years, and depending on which birth date you trust for him, you can round it to 40, the man from the very beginning of this story. The last one. Zubov came from minor nobility. He had charm, a pretty face, and a real talent for telling a lonely, aging, powerful woman exactly what she wanted to hear. And with Potyomkin gone, there was no one left to vet the choice or rein it in. She fell hard. Here is what makes Zubov different from every favourite before him. It's what Catherine let him become. The earlier men mostly stayed in their lane. Potyomkin earned his power by conquering Crimea and building a fleet. Zubov earned nothing. No victories, no gift for administration, no vision. And yet Catherine, besotted and increasingly isolated, kept handing him more. By the mid-1790s, Platon Zubov controlled an astonishing slice of the Russian government. Titles by the dozen, armies on paper, a seat at the centre of foreign policy. Ambassadors who wanted anything from Russia learned they had to go through this young man first. And they loathed it because he was arrogant, lazy, and out of his depth. And if incompetence were the only problem, the empire might have absorbed it. But then his entire family climbed up the rope behind him. His brothers were drowned in rank and riches. The Zubovs went from provincial nobodies to one of the wealthiest, most hated families in Russia in just a few years. They knew exactly how it had happened. And here's the detail everyone misses. They also knew exactly how fragile it was, because all of it rested on one thing: the heartbeat of a woman in her late 60s. The whole favourite system had a fatal flaw, and Zubov was perched right on top of it. A favourite's power was never real power. It was borrowed power. It lived only as long as Catherine lived, and only as long as she stayed fond of him. He had no army truly loyal to him, no independent base, no claim to anything. The moment she was gone, he was just an unpopular young man, buried in titles with a target on his back. If Zubov had understood that, this would be a very different story. He didn't. And there was a second problem, far bigger than Zubov, that had been building for decades. His name was Paul, Catherine's own son, the heir. Catherine and Paul despised each other. She had taken the throne over the dead body of his father. She had kept Paul away from power his entire adult life, sidelined, excluded, openly distrusted with the empire. There were even persistent rumours that in her final years she was preparing to skip Paul entirely and leave the crown to her grandson Alexander instead. So picture the autumn of 1796. An aging empress, a favourite 40 years younger, running the government on borrowed time, a bitter, vengeful heir in the wings who hated everything his mother built and everyone she raised up. The entire structure balanced on a single life, and that life was nearly over. The clock was already running. Zubov simply couldn't hear it. Then came the morning of November the 5th. Zubov had hours before everything he owned turned to smoke, and the clock had already started. We're back where we began. Catherine collapsed in the early morning and was carried to her bedroom, laid on a mattress on the floor because the bed couldn't be reached in time. The doctors came and bled her, the standard useless treatment of the age. She never woke, and in the hours that followed, the whole balance of the empire flipped. The first thing that happened, someone sent for Paul. The heir rode in from his residence outside the city, and the moment he arrived, the power drained out of Platon Zubov like water through a cracked glass. Hours earlier, he had been the most courted man in Russia. Now the crowd that waited every morning in his antechamber simply evaporated. Courtiers who had bowed to him pushed straight past him toward the new master. There's a story, probably embellished, but true to the moment, that Zubov was so terrified and so abandoned that Paul, in a flash of contempt mixed with something like pity, actually sent him a glass of wine and let him keep his head. Paul wanted him to feel exactly how far he had fallen. From running an empire to being pitied with a drink in a single day. Catherine died late on November the 6th, never having spoken again. 34 years on the throne, the largest empire on earth, ended on a mattress on the floor. And then Paul took his revenge, not only on the living. This is one of the strangest acts in the history of European monarchy. Paul had the body of his long-dead father dug up out of its grave. Peter, the husband Catherine had overthrown, dead 34 years. He had the remains brought to the palace and a crown placed on the coffin. Then he forced the old men still alive, who had helped Catherine seize power to walk in procession behind the bones of the man they'd helped destroy. And he buried his mother and father side by side, reuniting in death the couple who loathed each other in life as one final insult to her memory. The favourite system died with her. Paul had no interest in his mother's arrangement. The apartment below the Empress's chambers, the private staircase, the salary, the title, all of it simply ceased to exist. An institution that had defined the Russian court for over 30 years vanished inside a week. As for the Zubovs, stripped of power and pushed out of the capital. The young man who'd held 13 offices at once kept his fortune but lost everything that made him matter. He had bet it all on one life, and that life was gone. So yeah, not great. But Platon Zubov's story doesn't end there. Because 4.5 years later, this discarded favourite would walk into a dark bedroom and help kill the very man who took everything from him. Paul I was, by nearly every account, a difficult and increasingly paranoid emperor. He reversed his mother's policies, alienated the nobility, terrified his own officers, and built himself a fortified castle in the heart of the capital because he was convinced, correctly as it turned out, that people wanted him dead. On the night of March the 23rd, 1801, a group of conspirators, drunk and armed, entered that supposedly impregnable castle through doors left unlocked from the inside. They found the emperor hiding behind a screen in his bedroom. There was a struggle, and Paul I was strangled and beaten to death inside his own fortress, in the middle of his own capital. Among the conspirators coordinating the plot that night were the Zubov brothers. Platon Zubov, Catherine's last favourite, the boy she had loved and made powerful, was part of the group that killed her son. Follow the full circle of that. Catherine took her throne by removing her husband. Her son took his throne by burying her legacy. And her son lost his throne and his life, in part because of the very favourite she had raised from nothing. The intimate, personal system of power Catherine built didn't just shape her reign. It reached past her own death and helped destroy her son. After the murder, Zubov faded. The new emperor, Catherine's grandson Alexander, the one she may have wanted all along, had no use for men with blood on their hands, even blood that had cleared his own road to the throne. Zubov was quietly eased out of public life. He retreated to a vast estate in the Baltic provinces, in what is today Lithuania. And here is the strangest ending of any of Catherine's favourites. The young man who had been the lover of an empress who had run the largest empire on earth, who had helped murder a tsar, spent his final years as a miser. The most generous court in Europe had made him fabulously rich, and he ended up obsessed with hoarding it, reportedly counting his money, trusting no one, alone. Late in life, he married a young Polish woman. He died in 1822, in his 50s, far from St. Petersburg, far from the bedroom and the staircase and the antechamber full of waiting men. The most powerful favourite in Russian history died a wealthy, lonely, bitter man in the provinces. And the others? This is the part the propaganda never wanted you to know. Most of Catherine's favourites did not come to ruin. They were not discarded into poverty. They became the founders of great noble families. The estates, the titles, the fortunes she handed them, passed down through generations. Their descendants held high office, served future tsars, and survived inside the Russian aristocracy right up until the next great fall, the one this channel returns to, again and again, the revolution of 1917, when the entire world Catherine built was finally swept away. The Crimean cities Potyomkin founded for her are still on the map: Sevastopol, Kherson. Still in the news in our own time, fought over by armies, 2.5 centuries after a Tsar soldier raised them from empty ground to please the woman he may have secretly married. And Catherine herself lies in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, beside the husband she overthrew, in the grave her son forced them to share. Tourists file past her every day. Most of them know exactly one thing about her, and it's the lie. The obscene rumour her enemies invented, because they could not defeat her any honest way. That's the real tragedy of Catherine the Great. Not the men, not the apartment or the staircase. It's that one of the most capable rulers in human history is remembered for a slander, while the actual story, the empire, the cities, the strange and very human loneliness of a powerful woman who built a whole institution just so she would never have to be alone again, gets forgotten. Go back to that bedroom floor on the morning of November the 5th. A mattress dragged across cold stone, a 67-year-old woman who never spoke again, a boy 40 years younger, standing somewhere in the palace, about to lose everything. Except now you know what that scene actually was. Not the death of a scandalous old empress. The end of an institution she invented, the collapse of a system no ruler, before or since, ever dared build in the open. She wasn't remembered for what she built. She was remembered for a number. And now you know the number was never even true. The world Catherine built lasted 121 years after her death. Then, in a single freezing winter, it ended the way these stories so often do. A family in a basement, descendants scattered across the world. A dynasty asking the same question every dynasty on this channel eventually asks: where are they now? If you want to know what finally became of the empire Catherine spent her whole life expanding, the last family to wear her crown, and the descendants who survived them, that story is on the screen right now. Go find out where the last of the Romanovs ended up.